I will give the word to Javier Auyero, who comes from the University of Texas at Austin, who will speak on the state of the poor. So, Javier, thank you for coming and for doing such a long journey. You have the word.
Thank you. I think this is the second or third time that at a conference I have to speak after Loic, and I always go downhill from there. So anyway,
you keep getting invited, so obviously.
So two disclaimers. First, I'm seriously jet lagged, so if I start speaking Spanish or I fall asleep. And the second is that this is very, very much work in progress. And I don't say this in the usual, disclaimer guarding off, but I mean it. I'm in the middle of field work, and I'm very hesitant about some of the points I'm going to be making. So I welcome all sorts of criticisms. I was born amid bullets. I was raised among thugs. Read the graffiti sprayed on the outside walls of an elementary school in a shanty town in the outskirts of Buenos Aires. Inside, 10-year-old student Roberto draws a picture of a young thief holding a 9mm gun in his sketchbook, like that one. He tells me and Flavia, his teacher and my research collaborator, that he knows this type of gun well because both his brother and his uncle have one. Quote, my uncle goes out and steals around a nearby shantytown, and he's lookout. Did I tell you that my other uncle was killed by the police? He was robbing a bus. So the graffiti and Roberto's drawing and statement illustrate some of the different forms of violence that encircle the lives of urban poor in contemporary Buenos Aires. What I try to do in the paper is first describe these diverse forms of violence, criminal, domestic, private, public, and then explore the relationship between widespread violence and the actions and inactions of the state. And I'm going to make two arguments. The first one is, contrary to descriptions that isolate different forms of interpersonal violence, the paper argues that many of these seemingly disconnected types are in fact deeply entangled. Emphasizing more the showing than the telling, I want to inspect, what I do in the paper, inspect the links that connect one type of violence to another, and that forming what I call a chain of violence that overwhelms those living at the bottom of the socio-symbolic order. The second argument is that contrary to descriptions of destitute urban areas in the Americas as either governance voids deserted by the state or militarized spaces firmly controlled by the state's iron fist through a variety of governance techniques, I argue, again by way of empirical demonstration, that law enforcement in Buenos Aires high poverty areas is intermittent, selective, and contradictory. So by putting the state's fractured presence at the urban margins under the ethnographic microscope, we reveal in the paper its key role in the perpetration of the violence it is presumed to be preventing. So in order to examine the relationship between the depacification of poor people's daily lives and the state presence at the urban margins, the paper draws upon 30 months of collaborative ethnographic fieldwork in an area called Ingeniero Buque, which is a violence-ridden, low-income district located in metropolitan Buenos Aires. This poverty-stricken area is comprised by several historically working-class neighborhoods, newer shantytowns, and even newer squatter settlements. So you have the three very different urban forms within the area. Some of these pictures taken by the children and adolescents from the local school we're working with provide a sort of visual portrait of the extreme level of infrastructural deprivation in the area, or what Brown and McCarty would call the material dimensions of state abandonment. Characterize most of the area: unpaved street, open-air sewages, random garbage collection. In contemporary Buenos Aires, state violence against the poor takes many different forms: persistent arbitrary police violence, swelling prison rates that put in terms of prison growth, in terms of rates, puts us in comparative terms with the United States, not in terms of the actual rates, but in terms of the growth. Novel territorial sieges of marginalized communities, and increasing forceful evictions. But in our field site, most of the rampant daily violence is perpetrated by its residents against each other. Now, much has been debated about whether or not there is a new kind of violence in Latin America, whether we have moved from political violence to social and criminal ones. Now, having conducted and known this area, having conducted fieldwork and known this area for 20 years, all I can say here is that in its intensity and its variety, this indeed is a new kind of violence. And just to give you a very larger context, in terms of crime rates between 1995 and 2008, we see a doubling of criminal episodes. In terms of crimes against persons, we see the same thing. Now, social scientific journalistic descriptions of violence in what Loic just called territories of urban relegation abound in the Americas. Studies consistently show that lack of economic opportunities coupled with geographical isolation foster a climate where interpersonal violence and crime can become pervasive in inner cities, black ghettos, favelas, villas, comunas, poblaciones, colonias populares, just to use the terms that are used to describe urban areas where multiple forms of degradation accumulate. Now, research in psychology and community studies reveal that typically all these forms of violence, pile up. Many studies highlight these high rates of co-occurrence, for example, between community violence and domestic violence, and demonstrate that exposure to one kind of violence seldom takes place in pure forms. But we don't know how exactly different forms of violence associate with one another in real time and space. When the concatenation of violence involves the actions and inactions of the state, as I hope we show in the paper, our understanding is even more obscure. So a shootout here, a domestic fight there, a street brawl in the morning, a rape in the afternoon, a lynching at night. How and why is the general question that the paper seeks to answer. Are these different and seemingly disconnected types of violence associated? And then more specifically, when, how, and to what effect does the state police poor people's disputes in the place where they live? So in both US inner cities and Argentine shantytowns, street criminal violence is described and conceptualized in terms of dyadic exchanges, governed by the norm of reciprocity. Typically, the story goes, you assault my friend, I try to kill you. Tit for tat. Physical aggression is seen as a result of the lex talionis, right? So in a recent rendition, a Mossian gift of sorts, something that needs to be reciprocated. Now, much of the violence we detected during the course of 2.5 years of fieldwork resembles the one examined by students of gang and criminal street violence in the US and Argentina, in that it is the outcome of one-on-one retaliation and remains encapsulated in dyadic relationships. Now, if we pay attention to other forms of physical aggression that take place inside homes and outside in the streets, that we describe in detail in the paper with various ethnographic vignettes, we begin to see that violence transcends interpersonal exchange, taking a more expansive, less demarcated form. In the language of reciprocity, I think we need to understand, instead of a specific reciprocity, a form of diffused reciprocity, where the definition of equivalence is less precise, one partners may be viewed as a group rather than as a particular actor, and the sequence of events is less narrowly bounded. So a more comprehensive understanding of interpersonal violence that is shaking poor people's lives in Buenos Aires should approach it not solely as reciprocal exchange, but a series of interconnected events. A dyad, yes, but also a chain. Let me give you an example. A dispute between leaders over missing pavements, like the ones that took place oftentimes during our fieldwork, can be seen as the expression of retaliatory violence. And so can a woman's violent reaction to the assault of her drunk partner. But when dealers barge into a home, point a gun at the face of a mother of an addict, claim a drug payment, and they do so without regard of a woman's 6-year-old daughter, and when this same mother threatens to break the fingers of her addicted son, or actually punches him until, quote, I see blood coming out of his face, or call the cops, she knows they are involved in drug trafficking, to have her son arrested and taken away, in order to prevent him from stealing things from her house, things like a small TV set, and then he sells to finance his addiction. But those things do not belong to him, but to his mother's second husband, who, mad at the missing items, often beats her. If you follow that, you realize that it's not simply dyadic exchange. We believe that we are needing a sort of better, more encompassing image to capture what living in harm's way is all about. That is where the notion of chain, I think, comes in handy. And just to give you an example of the kinds of violence we're witnessing, these are murals that memorialize people who were murdered by store owners in the neighborhood, and these are some of the pictures that the kids that we're following, the way in which they illustrate the neighborhood. They shoot at each other, the police car, then we ask them, list, draw the things you like and the things you don't like. Playing soccer, what they don't like, people shooting at each other. Playing soccer, they don't like shooting at each other. And we did this over the course of 2 years. This is consistent. It's either shooting at each other or bullying or fighting, etc., etc. So what is the state doing to regulate poor people's interpersonal conflicts? Our field site sits adjacent to the biggest street market in the country, which is called La Salada, defined by the European Union as the world's emblem of the production and commercialization of falsified brand merchandise. It's the largest informal market, right? You can buy anything there. Twice a week, thousands of shoppers, mostly from lower and lower middle classes from metropolitan Buenos Aires, but also traders from the rest of the country, come to the market to purchase mostly apparel and small electronics. Hundreds of thousands of dollars and pesos in cash and merchandise travels through the streets of Ingeniero Bunge. Military style federal forces known as the National Guard, the Gendarmería, patrol the streets hours before and during these Días de Feria, these street fair days. Numerous and heavily armed with state-of-the-art equipment, the officers' imposing presence transform the area into what we call militarized space. But this militarization of marginality does not last for long. Once the market closes, the officers disappear from view until the next market day. They are replaced by the state police, not the greens, but the blues. And you can actually see in these two images how different they are in terms of the order they provide. See? Poorly paid, trained and equipped, the state police, known as la bonaerense, patrol the streets when the National Guard is gone. 30 months of observations and innumerable conversations with residents reveal a highly skewed and contradictory character of this intermittent law enforcement. And let me present only two of the testimonies or vignettes that pretty much summarize the way in which the state makes itself present in the area. One comes from a drug dealer, the other one comes from a car thief. The dealer. When we first started dealing in Las Violetas, a nearby poor neighborhood, we had an arrangement with the police. Every weekend they would come to pick up the envelope, to receive the cut. The cops knew we were selling drugs, but they didn't bother us. They would release the area for us, a practice that is quite established in the metropolitan, in the police of Buenos Aires, to sort of release the area for sort of criminal activity. Now, if you don't pay them every weekend, you're in trouble. You end up in jail. Then we moved to another neighborhood. We were selling cocaine, lots of it. There, the arrangement was with the gendarmes. See? So, see, he tells us, it's all about different territories. Some for the cops, some for the National Guard. The car theft. At a time, says Amelia, referring to the late 1990s and early 2000s, there were not many things, this is the deep, end of the crisis in Argentina. There are not many things a single mother with 3 kids and no job could do. I've done everything. Stealing cars, selling drugs, robbing people in the streets, you name it. I did everything. And in one of those beautiful ethnographic moments, she's cooking and she's talking with us. She points to the knives in front of us and starts picking the different Tramontina knives and starts saying, see, with this you open the dashboard of a Volkswagen. But with this one, you can open a Fiat. And see, and she start telling us how she actually, steals cars. We used to disassemble the cars super fast. The next morning, traders would come and buy from us. It was easy, and the police would not bother. We would arrange with them beforehand, and they would release the area from interferences. Once, after some petty neighborhood drug dealers, policemen would employ shock and awe tactics, inundating an area of the neighborhood with police cars. In cases such as these, sirens, loud orders, and usual shoot mark its fast and furious presence in the neighborhood. But as the testimony above illustrates, and many that for reasons of space I can present now, and as described in other poverty enclaves throughout Latin America, and most notably in Rio de Janeiro's favelas, the local police protect some dealers and thieves and go publicly and aggressively after others, becoming an integral part of the crime they seek to combat. Quote, it is easy to make a deal with the police. They come to you for their commission. Every night you need to give them 500 pesos or 600 and they leave you alone. 2 women involved in petty drug dealing told us. The police is also a key participant in the black market of guns and bullets. Everybody knows in the neighborhood where to rent a gun, where to buy bullets. The fact that there are very low sort of murder rates it might be explained by the quality of the guns that are available. The good thing for Argentina, for Buenos Aires, is that we're very far from the U.S. So we're not killing each other, with U.S. Smuggled weapons, but that's different. Law enforcement is not only intermittent and contradictory, but also highly selective. Police chase and incarcerate some petty drug dealers as thieves, but is slow and hesitant when it has to go after violent partners, of course, and virtually absent when it comes to intervene around widespread illegal child labor. And we repeatedly heard stories about domestic violence in which the police was nowhere to be found. Quote, "The cops always come late, after they rape you, after they beat you. They come to pick up the dead body, or to stitch you if you've been raped." And cases of infant labor that go totally unsanctioned. Now, law enforcement is fast and sluggish, watchful and neglectful, depending on the kind of wrongdoing and the parties involved. As a result, residents suffer all sorts of victimization, but are unwilling to resort to the police because they intuitively know that agents will not act on their claims, or they suspect that they're either perpetrators of crime or in close association with the criminals. Now, one last tale from the field illustrates the relationship between violence and this particular type of state presence in bold-faced relief. Many residents believe, and told us in quite explicit ways, that during the nights before the fair opens to the public, the street fair, the buses that bring shoppers from the provinces become makeshift brothels. Inside the empty buses that await shoppers, neighborhood adolescents exchange sexual services, and according to many, I'm being quite explicit in this, blowjobs in particular, for money. Now, long-distance drivers, and to our surprise, the cops that patrol the area, are the girls' main clients. Now, we were never able to authenticate stories about what many people in the area call the blowjob police. Now, we do have plenty of evidence of their involvement in drug trade, in theft, extortion, and the provision of arms and bullets to the criminals. However, the shared understanding about police agents' illicit relationship with adolescents in the neighborhood is important because it accounts for why residents often hesitate and seldom resort to the police to denounce episodes of sexual violence that are very, very common in the neighborhood. Referring to the presence of the violines, those who violan, i.e. rapists, and suggesting another way in which different kinds of violence relate to another, Noelia, age 9, tells her teacher, Flavia, that, quote, "My cousin was almost raped yesterday. Neighbors went to the home of those violines, those rapists, and kicked their door down." "What are the violines?" the teacher asks. "Those who make you babies," 8-year-old Josiana answers matter-of-factly. Why, we could ask, would anybody in the community seek the help of a local cop when they are believed to be doing that with adolescents in the parking lots adjacent to the market? Lynching, not going to the police, is a sociological collective answer. Now, if people in the neighborhood define the existence of a blowjob police as real, then Sociology 101, it's real in its consequences. For residents, their definition guides the lack of trust in the police to address sexual crimes. And let me conclude, because they told me it has to be 20 minutes, and it's 20 minutes, 18. In a now classic article on transformations of aggressiveness, Elias writes that, quote, "In the Middle Ages, robbing, fighting, hunting men and animals, all these form part and parcel of everyday life. Only gradually, as a central power strong enough to compel restraint begins to grow," he says, "people feel constrained to live in peace with one another." In other words, for Elias, the relatively peaceful collective life of large masses of people in a given territory is, in good part, based on the actions of a state that consistently pacifies the social spaces in which people interact and police their disputes. And that is also the argument of Eloic in Elias in the Ghetto. What I think we show in the paper is the exact opposite of this civilizing process that Elias describes. The intermittent, contradictory, and selective ways in which law enforcement works at the urban margins is not the only explanation of the chain of violence. There are many other, the removal of mechanisms of formal social control, degradation, general degradation in the lives. But I'm zooming on the presence or mispresence of the state that helps to explain why the poor are constantly in harm's way. Thank you.
Thank you for perfect management of time. I know we now can open a few questions. That was what we have programmed, so we can open the dialogue for 10 minutes, and then we'll start with Kim and then with Frank. So, questions, please. One.
It's just a clarification question. If you could just be, I know you were good on the time management, but I just didn't quite get the meat of the last point that you made. If you could just be more explicit and go a bit more.
And the paper tries to make, I know I was rushing out. One is that forms of violence that typically were studied separately, and there's scholarship on domestic violence, scholarship on family violence, scholarship on street violence. Even ethnographers, Philippe Bourgoin or Venkatesh, note that there are episodes of domestic violence, but they zoom on street violence and criminal violence. They don't talk about it. Journalistic accounts also talk about this overlap. What we're trying to do is how to sort of dissect the way in which they actually connect in real time and space. And so how a dispute between dealers actually ends up becoming a dispute between domestic partners. That's one part of the project. The other is seeing how the state is involved in this. Not only by just not doing something, but actually involved in the production of violence. It is a sort of, I didn't think this before, but Loic was saying before how the state is actually, enmeshed in the production of precarity. Well, the argument is simple, analogically, is analogous. Is the way with this particular state is involved in the production of these violent territories. It's not a violence that the state is always in opposition to this. It's actually producing this violence by the existence of a blowjob police, by not regulating the street market, by doing what they are doing with drug dealers, by doing what they are doing with domestic partners, etc., etc. So it's not that it's only either represses or absence. It's actually producing.
We have
Said that in 2 minutes instead of 20.
We have time for another question. Go
I think you're making a fascinating and really important point. And I think most of us know that you're right, that distinction between public and private, or public and domestic violence makes little sense. I wonder what the gender dimension of this is, though, because you're saying, I know you're summarizing complex material, but you seem to say the violence of the street gets into the home. And I wonder about the other way around, because it seems to me that the women I've worked with in the US, it's actually the violence of the home getting into the street. So it's a private conflict between two cousins about some he says, she says stuff, as they say, that then gets acted out very publicly. It becomes a community violent thing where everybody's cutting everybody else with razor blades. And so I was just wondering, do you think that that's gendered? Is it more like the market, drug market-related violence becomes through the male family members private, and the private violence becomes through the females public?
For analytical purposes, I wish it were that way. And most of the literature would point to street violence between men, domestic violence, the victims are women. What we're seeing in most of the evidence is a lot of women doing violence, both private and public.
Yeah.
And so there is a sort of, if you use gender as a category of analysis, there is a gender dimension, but it doesn't fall along the traditional lines of women are doing this, men are doing that.
I have not made my perfect opinion. I'm not suggesting that women are the victims and men are doing it, but rather that women are taking their private conflicts public, whereas men seem to become victims of violence, if you want to put it that way, once they take the street into the house. Like the example you give with the woman beating up her kid because he's doing drugs or whatever, and that takes the street into the house, where it seems that the women are doing the exact opposite.
It could be, and one of the things we're doing is gendering the uses of violence. What I said is that violence has been used as a retaliation.
Yeah.
We're seeing, for example, that violence is used to discipline kids, right? And violence is used, of course, to gain respect and recognition. Violence is used to settle accounts. Violence is, there are many uses, and of course they are gendered. I don't have a clear picture of, how does it all fit, to be totally honest. We also are seeing that violence is indeed a learned disposition. I'm not saying, I don't want to argue that violence is being produced by this Deus ex machina, like the code of the street, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think you argue against that pretty convincingly. But it becomes a learned disposition. Just one, and I shut up. We're interviewing these women, and she's telling us about she's reporting about a fight they had at the community center the other day, and she tells us, the other day I could have killed him. I know how to kill you guys. And she goes like, do you know what you guys have here, that Adam apple? And you know that? And we're like, yes. She grabs an apple. She grabs an apple. And she does like this. This is how you kill you. Tuck. And he does like this. Tuck. And so we are like completely speechless, and says, my grandfather told me how to defend myself. I was 8, and my degenerate brother would, want to rape me, and so he taught me how to kill with my bare hands, and she did this. I mean, violence is indeed a learned disposition that travels, because you actually see that, domestic and public. Am I making sense, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I don't want to dominate, but
Okay.
Should I? Or-
No.
Because I think you're pointing to something really important. You have to write this up and get it in some American journal. Because I think what you're pointing to is that sort of artificial distinction that we find, for example, in the guy who's never taken on and argued against, Elia Anderson. I mean, he does beautiful stuff and all that, but I think what he does is he creates a picture of there's decent people who just act out street outside if they have to, because that's their way of survival, and there's hoodlums. And I think that picture is completely flawed. And it's exactly the most, quote-unquote, decent women, the women that cares most about their kids not getting gang raped, not getting that and that. That's the women that get the belt and beat the girl. And they beat her up because it's like their only way of telling them, you really cannot stay at night out. And I think that idea of that, and I think that you have great material to sort of take on that argument. There's, just like you say, there's a distinction between you can't think domestic violence and public violence is two things. I also think you can't think the morality of violence without in those categories as saying, there's either the bad guys, the hoodlums, or the decent ones. I think it's excellent.
It's just 1 minute. I mean, someone here has argued better than I can do against this artificial distinction between, decent and families. Noted in the story that I just gave you about the apple, that she told us a story as the best advice from a caring parent that she could have received, right? So, in my mind, I don't have these morality issues about violence. I don't know why, maybe I wasn't not contaminated enough by U.S. sociology to begin with. I think violence is indeed a sort of Tillian repertoire of, a way of solving individual and collective problems. And so, in that, it forms a continuum. It doesn't, these artificial divisions don't matter that in my mind. But, sorry, I shut up.
Okay. Final question from
You should note Philippe Bourgois presented a paper 2 weeks ago in New York about rageful violence as a disposition based on his current field work in a small Puerto Rican neighborhood of Philly, so you should definitely read that paper. I have a question about the cops. They live not in this neighborhood, but they live in very similar neighborhoods in which they encounter in their everyday life similar levels, intensity, frequency, and linkages of these chains of violence. How do they handle them when they're off duty?
Well, one of the things I don't have data on is police murder. That has been increasing. There is this very gray zone between what cops do on duty and off duty. I have ethnographic anecdotes or anecdotes, vignettes, put it that anecdote. Of people telling what they get from cops when they are doing it. These kids get their fancy iPhones from their parents who are cops who take the drugs and the iPhones and everything away from regular cops. I have not done, and Nancy Shepherd Hughes suggested that I should do that, and I don't have the guts to do it. Sort of going on the other side and see how this is lived and experienced by the cops themselves.
Because in a sense they are a living analyzer of the double-sidedness of the state. They are agents of the state who are there supposedly to prevent and to sanction violence, and yet they are agents of violence themselves. And when they return to their neighbor as a neighbor, so legally, like if there's an assault or something and they intervene, are they considered
They
law
can
enforcement
carry
agents?
off-duty
Yeah.
cops, and the transas, the drug dealers, know who they are because they do business with them. I mean, the people have been arguing for a long time that the reason why we don't have the type of drug dealing that in Brazil and in Colombia organized around the cartels is because the state police is the cartel, and so that simplifies on the one hand and complicates the matter on the other.
Okay, thank you very much.
It was good.